Do you have green fingers? When was the last time you weeded the garden? Life's not always a bed of roses, but if you listen to this podcast about gardening vocabulary, it might sow a few seeds of curiosity and help you on the way to improving your English. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name's Craig.
And my name is Reza.
And with nearly 50 years of teaching English between us, Reza and I are going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you, Reza?
I'm feeling very well, Craig, and I'm enjoying this spring weather. We're recording this in spring, a time of the year that I like very much. So I feel good. And you?
Yeah, fantastic. And it's really good to see you because this is the first time in a long time that Reza and I have been in the same physical space recording a podcast together. So it's really good to see you on the other side of the table there.
Yeah, same here. As Craig said, it's far nicer and far easier to be face-to-face recording.
And we get a really nice lunch when we're finished.
Yeah, for me, that's the best bit of all.
So this week we're speaking about gardening expressions. But first we have a voice message from Monica from Valencia.
Hey Reza, hey Craig. I am Monica from Valencia. I am learning English for about 3 years and I came across your podcast almost a year ago and I have been listening to them ever since. Thank you very much for your work. It's helping me a lot. I would like to say about your latest podcast. I am a huge fan of chocolate and my favorite is the dark one. In my city, Sueca, near Valencia, about 30 minutes by train, there is a local museum about chocolate and they make chocolate with cinnamon, which is the best. If you want to try it, both of you are invited. Thank you very much again and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Monica, for getting in touch and sending in your message. I had no idea that there was a chocolate museum in Sueca. Did you know?
I had no idea either. And we're quite close to Sueca.
Yeah. And I checked the website, which looks very interesting. I'll put a link in the show notes if anyone's interested in checking out and looking at the chocolate museum in Sueca. And the show notes for this episode are at inglespodcast.com/356. Monica was speaking about an episode we did recently about chocolate. It was episode 353, if you want to listen. Any comments on Monica's message?
Monica, that was a very clear message and I understood everything. However, there were one or two things we could maybe improve to make it even better. I think you said I am learning English for about 3 years, but you should say I have been learning English for about 3 years. Present perfect continuous, have been, and the verb ing, because you started it in the past, 3 years ago to be exact, but you're still doing it now. So it's present perfect continuous. I've been learning.
I really liked the use of the phrasal verb to come across, Monica. To come across means to find by accident. And Monica said that she came across the podcast. So very good. One thing, Monica, when you started your message, you said, I am Monica from Valencia, which I think is a direct translation from soy in Spanish. But it's more common on the telephone and sending messages to say, this is Monica or it's Monica. So this is Monica from Valencia or it's Monica. It's Monica.
On the whole, Monica, I think your pronunciation was pretty good, except perhaps one or two words. I noticed that she said science, a very typical mispronunciation. It should be ever since. Yeah, because often when you see I-N-C-E, it is pronounced eins, isn't it? But not with this word. It's ever since. Did you notice any other pronunciation, Craig?
Yeah, one little thing, the word cinnamon, one of my favourite spices, cinnamon. That's the pronunciation in English. Thank you very much for your message, Monica, and I will definitely visit that museum if it's open next time I visit Sueca. Thank you for the information.
Well, let's get down to the main business of this episode, which is to talk about gardening. Let's start off with some gardening tools and equipment. Craig, a very important thing for many British people is a shed, or some people might say tool shed. That's cobertizo or caseta, the place where you keep things in your garden. When you lived in England, did you have a shed?
In one house that I lived in, we did have a shed where my dad kept all the gardening tools and the tools he used in the house. Actually, a friend of mine has a nickname, un apodo in Spanish, out in the shed. That's his nickname. Because whenever his wife wants to find him, he's always out in the shed. So his nickname is, hey, out in the shed. He's always outside doing something in the shed.
Another useful piece of equipment that you'll see in many British gardens, particularly bigger ones, is a wheelbarrow. That's a compound word. So the word wheel, that round thing that moves around, the rueda, and barrow, wheelbarrow, it's carretilla. So basically, it's like something which looks a bit like a container for throwing things away or for moving things on top of a wheel. That's basically it. So that's why we call it a wheelbarrow.
Have you ever heard of a barrow boy?
No, what's that?
That was the job my dad had when he left school. My dad left school when he was 14, very young, and he worked in Covent Garden. Some listeners might know the area in London, Covent Garden, that's now quite an expensive area of shops where you sometimes see musical street performances. But years and years ago, it was a fruit and vegetable market. And when my dad started working, he was a barrow boy in Covent Garden Market, which meant he had a kind of a wheelbarrow that he wheeled around delivering fruit and vegetables to people in the market.
Wow. I'm sure that's a job title or description which doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah, maybe one of the professions that's no longer in use, a barrow boy.
I'd like to see somebody do that on Zoom.
Maybe that's the noise they make if they go really quickly. It's like zoom. Well, there goes a barrow boy. Some of you may know the word grass or césped in Spanish because it's very common in the UK to have an area in the front of the house, the front garden, or the back of the house, the back garden, that's covered with grass, that green stuff that grows in the earth. But if grass is in a particular restricted area and it's cared for and cut regularly, it's called a lawn, Lawn. And the tool you use to cut the lawn is a lawnmower. So the verb to mow, M-O-W, means to cut the grass or the lawn.
Another tool you can use for cutting grass, but it's not quite as quick, is garden shears or garden clippers. I better spell shears. S-H-E-A-R-S. Garden shears. So they're tijeras de podar, to cut things back, to shear. It can also be a verb, in fact, to shear. So garden shears or clippers, they shear or they clip is also a verb. They take off a little bit.
When you were growing up in Belfast, you obviously had a garden, right?
Front and back, yeah.
Front and back. So did you use clippers and shears? Did you mow the grass, mow the lawn?
Yes, I remember for many years we didn't have an electric lawnmower. It was a non-electric lawnmower just with blades, aspas, which went around.
And you pushed it.
Pushed it backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
And the tricky bits, particularly around the edge and other bits, you had to do with shears.
That's right. I remember that. I used to do that. Yeah. If you want to dig the earth or the soil, S-O-I-L, the earth or the soil in your garden, then you probably need a special tool called a spade, S-P-A-D-E, which is pala in Spanish. But a spade has a flat blade with straight edges. So a spade is often used when you want to shape or cut your lawn, for example. And there's a similar word to spade, isn't there, Reza, that's not exactly the same?
Yes, in fact, even some native speakers might get mixed up with these two sometimes. Shovel, S-H-O-V-E-L. If you look in a dictionary for Spanish, it's not going to help you at all. They both come out as pala, but they're not the same. The shovel has slightly concave blade with a rounded or a pointed tip. So yeah, you can dig with a shovel, you can dig with a spade, but as Craig said, they're not quite the same. Shovels are better for cutting things. So imagine you wanted to cut through roots in the ground, right? Because it has a point and it's kind of rounded, it might be better for that. Spades are better for moving things.
But both of those tools you can use to dig, and try to remember that word if you didn't know it, D-I-G, to dig, because it's used obviously to make holes in the ground or to work in the garden, but you can also use it idiomatically in expressions like to dig for a compliment, for example, means you're searching or looking for a compliment. Oh, he's digging for compliments, he's looking to be complimented.
There's another expression related to using spades, apart from to dig for a compliment, and you probably wouldn't guess it unless you already knew it. To call a spade a spade.
It's quite obvious, isn't it?
You might be thinking, well, what else are you going to call it? I suppose you could call it a shovel by mistake, it's true, but to call a spade means to say things as they are. Don't try and dress it up. Don't try and say it in an indirect way. Don't try and make it sound better or different than it is. Just say it exactly the way it is. To call a spade a spade.
When you're eating, you probably use a knife and fork, but the word fork can also be used in gardening. A fork looks exactly like a fork, but it's bigger. So you use it to turn over the soil and aerate the soil, put air into the soil and break up the soil into small pieces. So a fork is an easy word to remember because it looks like a fork.
Another essential item for any good gardener is a bucket. B-U-C-K-E-T. A bucket. Cubo, you could say, or perhaps balde, cubeta, tobo, depends what country you're in. Here in Spain.
I've learned so many new words doing this episode, checking up these words. I didn't know that there were so many variations of bucket.
Yes, and Craig and I were always mindful that we do have listeners in different countries that use different words. A collocation which all English speakers will know is bucket and spade. They often go together. And not just for the garden. When you go to the beach, you quite often bring a bucket and spade to play with the sand on the beach.
And of course, you always use a bucket when you mop your floor because you have to put the water somewhere. So it's common in the house as well to use a bucket and a broom. B-R-O-O-M is escoba in Spanish. A broom is used to sweep, S-W-E-E-P, to sweep the house and also to sweep the garden path, for example.
An object which some people might use, depending on what you've got in your garden, is an axe. A-X-E, hacha. Or maybe a slightly smaller version of a similar idea, hatchet, H-A-T-C-H-E-T, which is destral, like a little mini axe for, cutting thicker branches and things like that.
An axe can also be used idiomatically. You can axe workers from a company or axe staff, which means you're chopping off some of the workers and reducing the amount of people in the company. So if people get axed, that means they lose their jobs. Fertilizer is another useful word because a good gardener or farmer needs to put the minerals and goodness back in the soil or in the earth. So fertilizer, or abono, fertilizante in Spanish, is used to put the richness and the goodness back into the soil, make things grow better.
A rake, R-A-K-E, rastrillo, is another very important object, particularly if you want to rake up the leaves, for example. So you drag them around using this object to gather them together. But Craig, they say that you should never rake up the past. Would you agree?
Yes, if you rake up the past, you uncover secrets that maybe should be left buried or hidden. So yeah, don't rake up the past. Leave things as they are.
Craig, do you have much experience with hoes?
Only at Christmas when I see Santa Claus and he says ho, ho, ho. But if you spell it H-O-E, which is another word I learned doing research for this podcast, azada in Spanish. So ho. And it's also a verb. So it's the tool you use, it's the noun and the verb to hoe the garden.
If you're a conscientious, good gardener, you'll want to water your plants. You all know the word water, I guess, but it can also be a verb, regar, and you'll need a watering can, the object where you put the water to pour it over the plants.
That can be confusing because there's another word which I think also translates to regar, which is to irrigate. But that's more for farmers with big fields. If you irrigate crops and things you're growing, then you're giving it water, but in a more industrial way. So for gardening, to water is a better verb.
I want to mention two objects which people might confuse, but they're not exactly the same. The first has several names. Pruning shears. So you could probably guess that there's a verb to prune, and it's podar, which we mentioned earlier, didn't we, when we talked about garden shears or clippers. So there are many ways of podar in English, right? This is another way. So pruning shears, or pruners, some people call them, or some people, including my mum, insist in calling them secateurs.
My mum used to call them secateurs as well.
So maybe that's an old-fashioned word, but it certainly exists. And I better explain exactly what they're for. They're to prune, as we said, podar, but in the sense of removing unhealthy or unwanted bits that are going to do harm to the plants. Because there's a very similar type of verb, which is also podar, or recortar, which is to trim. And you would use a cutter or a trimmer for that. But that's, if you're going to trim something, that's removing bits more for aesthetic reasons, not necessarily because you have to, but because you want the plant or the bush or whatever it is to look nicer or be a bit smaller, but it's more for aesthetic reasons. So we've got to prune, more for necessity, and to trim for aesthetic reasons.
I suppose like your hair, if you need just a little haircut but not a big haircut, then you'd go for a trim. So the hairdresser would trim your hair to make it look aesthetically better. Speaking of trimming, another thing you can trim, if you have one, is your hedge. Hedge, hedge. That sound at the end of the word is the same sound as in judge or June, July, January, so hedge. What's a hedge? In Spanish, it's seto, and it's very common in the UK to have hedges around the garden. So they grow up to a height where they can give you some privacy from your neighbours. So you need to trim your hedge. What do you use? You use a hedge trimmer.
Just to clarify, because some people might not be familiar with the concept or may not have seen many hedges in their time, because I've realised that it's a very British and Irish thing.
It's very common in Ireland.
Yeah, you don't see many hedges in Spain, and I get the impression you don't in South America either. Hedges are basically when you got lots of bushes, that's arbusto, all in a row. So many in a row, and they form the hedge.
They connected, aren't they?
They connect kind of up, they grow into each other, so they form some kind of dividing line or division. So they can be found within gardens to divide different sections, or at the edge of the garden, or very importantly, they're also used to show the limits of farmers' land. Which bit of the countryside belongs to which farmer is very often in Britain and Ireland marked by a hedge.
I can remember driving around Ireland years ago when I visited there, seeing hedges on the side of the roads everywhere in the countryside. There were always hedges at the side of the road.
It makes driving very difficult. It really complicates your life. It affects the visibility, but you got to get used to it if you go there.
And to use a phrasal verb that Monica used earlier, come across, you might come across the word hedge in the collocation hedge fund, which is fondo de cobertura in Spanish. In finance, I know we have some people interested in finance listening, so a hedge fund you may have heard of, and the expression to hedge your bets, which means to play it safe and to keep low risk, not take chances.
Another thing you might have in your garden, particularly if you're a guiri or a gringo, is a deck chair.
Have you got one?
My mum uses one in the summer from time to time.
Is it striped? Does it have different colours?
It is, of course, yeah, the classic colours, yeah. A deck chair. So what is it? It's a folding seat. It's one of the things that you can bring to the beach if you want, or you can have it in your garden. Or you might have something similar, which is a sunbed. So obviously, it's a type of bed. You can be horizontal on a sunbed. So either a deck chair or a sunbed are commonly found in Guiri's gardens.
Yeah, we had deck chairs many years ago, and then my mum bought 2 sunbeds, which we used about 2 or 3 days a year when the sun came out in the UK. Hardly ever. Similar to a hedge, but not natural, so not made of bushes, is a fence. Fences can be made from wood or metal or plastic. And in Spanish you might say valla or verja or cerca. And also, as Reza said earlier about the farmers separating their land, fences very often separate gardens in the UK. When there's one garden next to another garden, the fence will divide your garden from your neighbour's garden. Can you think of any expressions with the word fence?
Yes, good fences make good neighbours. Do you agree with that?
What does it mean?
Well, it actually was invented in the United States, but all English speakers know it now. It means that it's good to know where everybody's responsibilities and limitations are. And if you put up a good fence between your land and your neighbours, there won't be any disputes about land. So you'll be good neighbours. So good fences, rather than creating trouble, in fact, is going to create peace. Good fences make good neighbours.
So know your boundaries.
Exactly. Would you agree with the sentiment?
Yes, I would, because it's very good to know your limitations and where your responsibility ends. For example, if there's a tree, but there's no fence, maybe it's your tree, maybe it's your neighbour's tree. So you have to know where your boundaries, where your fence is. Another expression is the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Now that could be a literal sentence. Your neighbour has greener grass, a better lawn than you. Or it could mean we're never really happy with the things we have. We're never happy with our grass or our car or our stereo system or our flat. We're always looking at what other people have. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence.
And maybe what you should do, to use another expression, is simply take time to smell the roses. Don't worry about who's got what, if you can improve this or that. So rather than thinking, oh, the grass is always greener on the other side, take time to smell the roses. Enjoy what you've got. Enjoy life. There's a good situation here. Don't get stressed about other things.
Similar to a fence is a railing, R-A-I-L-I-N-G. Railing or railings are often made from iron. It's like an iron fence. Perhaps you'd say reja in Spanish, but for me, a reja is usually on the windows. I mean, yeah, it can be on the door, but if you have pieces of iron on the window, I would call that bars on the window rather than railings. For me, railings have a similar function to a fence. Do you agree? It's just made from different material and it has gaps in the middle.
For me, railings make me think of myself when I'm in Spain, because railings for me in Spain are quite often my name mispronounced when I get it. When I'm in a waiting room, I go, they're looking at the piece of reja? I go, yeah, that'll be me. Mr. Railings here. So I often get called reja.
Railings Shah.
Yeah.
That's funny. You know the word bed, that's where you sleep, but did you know that you can have a flower bed. And a flower bed is where flowers are, where you plant your flowers. In Spanish, lecho de flores or macizo. Another use of that word bed, which is unusual, is the seabed, because the bottom of the sea we also call a bed. So seabed and flower bed.
In the garden, you might have a compost heap. A heap, H-E-A-P, is similar to a pile of things put on top of each other. And compost is organic material which you can use to later fertilize the soil, that brown material where you put the plants. So you might have a compost heap in your garden. Another thing you might have, particularly if you're a giddies love this, is a vegetable garden or a vegetable plot. You very often hear of people even having a plot which is not in their garden. In Britain, still to this day, although it's a tradition which is disappearing, people often rent a plot of land in a city or near a city, and they have to go there. It'll be like 5 or 10 minutes away from their house, maybe further if you live in London. And you go there, and there you have your little plot with your vegetables.
Well, we have a friend who we work with who does that. John, he's got a plot.
That's right. In Valencia, a lot of people seem to have a plot in Alboraya.
Yeah.
That's where he's got his. Here in Valencia, we would say huerto, definitely for that. But I think, Craig, you found another word, hortaliza.
Yes. I'm not sure in which countries that would be.
I think Mexico.
Is it Mexico?
Because I checked it, because for Spanish people from Spain, hortaliza means a leafy vegetable.
Oh, yes, that's true.
Confusing. So, but you're quite right. From what I could see from Googling it, in Mexico, hortaliza means the same as huerto in Spain, which is plot.
And some people do not have plots where they can grow plants, etc., but they do have a greenhouse. And a greenhouse is very common in cold countries because it gives the plants better temperature, so you can grow things that won't die in cold weather.
Are they always green?
They're made of glass, and I think the green is because of what's inside them, not because what they're made of. Greenhouse in Spanish is invernadero. Did you have one in Belfast?
No.
Me neither.
Pot, P-O-T, is a very important word. Maceta, that would be. So you can obviously put plants or flowers in a pot. Has another important meaning in slang English. Pot can mean marijuana as well. So if somebody says they smoke pot, they're not smoking a maceta. No, they're smoking marijuana. And therefore we have the expression a potted plant. Or you can also say a pot plant. So that's planta de maceta, a plant that's in a pot.
One thing you don't want in your garden are weeds. W-E-E-D-S. Weed is mala hierba. So if you have weeds in your garden, you need to weed the garden. So it's a noun and a verb. So to weed the garden is to remove the bad plants from the garden. And weed is also another slang word for marijuana.
And there's a good expression with weed. To weed something out or to weed someone out is using it metaphorically to get rid of something or someone which is causing problems. You weed that thing or that person out.
Yeah, that's very common also in an interview process. If you're interviewing applicants for a job in the early stages, then the employer will weed out the applicants that are not suitable, which just means remove the ones that are not good for the job.
Craig, I think you mentioned a word earlier, seeds, and the verb to sow seeds. That's S-O-W, because there are a few words in English which sound so. We got S-O, we got S-O-W, and we got S-E-W. But we're talking here about S-O-W. To sow seeds is sembrar. And there's a nice expression, which is, I think, the same in Spanish. It translates directly to reap what you sow. So to reap is cosechar, to get something out of the land. So we all know that you reap what you sow. In other words, do bad things, go causing trouble, and you're going to get trouble. But be nice, distribute good karma around there, and hopefully the good karma will come back to you.
That's very true for English students as well. If you invest a lot of time in your English studies, then you'll get back the rewards. So you reap what you sow. Have you heard the song Perfect Day? Lou Reed?
Oh, yeah, one of my favorite songs.
That line is in the song.
Yeah. You're going to reap just what you sow. Craig, we've mentioned quite a few expressions and idioms already. Can you think of any more?
Well, we began this episode with the expression to have green fingers. Now, that does not mean that your fingers are literally green. That means that you're very good with growing things, flowers, plants, vegetables, etc. So if a person has green fingers, they're naturally good at growing things, which is definitely not me. If I have a plant here on the balcony, for example, it dies within a month or two. So I do not have green fingers. Would you say that you had green fingers?
I'm afraid not. And I envy people who do. I think it's a great natural skill to have. Craig, the verb and the noun bloom whenever flowers appear. Yes, so flowers aren't necessarily there all the time. They appear at certain times of the year. They bloom. If I said to you, she's a late bloomer, what would I mean by that expression?
I would say that she matures or develops as a person very late. Now, that could be sexually, it could be intellectually, it could be personality or character-wise. Any comparison with the way that flowers open and the way that you develop as a person could be used with this idiom. Were you a late bloomer or an early bloomer?
I think early bloomer, and now I'm already over the hill.
I don't think I've bloomed yet. I think I've got time to bloom. I'm still maturing and learning about myself.
Would you say you're a busy person, Craig?
I have been, the last few weeks, I've been as busy as a bee.
Aha. So I guess that means really busy, yeah? Because if you think about it, listeners, bees, they always seem to be doing something. There they are moving around the garden, pollinating the plants. They never seem to rest. So if you're as busy as a bee, you're very busy.
It might be because my wife's always telling me to buzz off, which means go away.
And Craig, if I was to want to say that something is very fresh, yeah, it's recently made, it's not old, what flower might I use in my expression?
Well, you could use the English word for margarita, which is daisy. As fresh as a daisy means very, very alive and fresh and connected to things and awake. I didn't sleep very well last night, so this morning I'm not as fresh as a daisy, but you look as fresh as a daisy. You look very awake and very happy and very pleased to be here.
I do feel quite fresh and awake today. Hopefully, it's a long time before either of us will be pushing up the daisies. That's quite the opposite. If you're pushing up the daisies, well, think about it. Why would you be physically pushing, with your hands, pushing up daisies? Because you're under the ground. You've got daisies on top of you. In other words, you're dead. You're dead and you've been buried, so there's daisies on top of you. So it's a euphemism for dead, pushing up the daisies.
We talked about the word bush before, arbusto. There's been some famous bushes. There's been George Bush and Jed Bush and Barbara Bush and Kate Bush, a famous singer. But if you beat around the bush, then you don't say what you mean. So beat, B-E-A-T, around the bush. You don't get straight to the point. You don't say exactly what you're thinking. So you could say to someone, don't beat about the bush. Tell me what you think.
Now, in bushes, you better be careful that you don't cut yourself, and also in other plants, roses and other things, because they have thorns, Thorn. That's that little, usually kind of triangular, kind of pointy shaped thing, which can cut you, or probably better to say prick you. It can stick into you and puncture your skin. And if you say a person is a thorn in your side, Can you imagine having that thing stuck into you? Really annoying. Something annoying that just won't go away. So a thorn in the side is someone, or it could be something, I guess, which is irritating and you can't seem to easily get rid of it.
So, for example, the coronavirus restrictions, they could be a thorn in your side if you need to do something, but you can't because of the restrictions. Oh, it's a thorn in my side.
Craig, have you ever been led up the garden path?
Yes, a few times. That means to be deceived or maybe tricked or fooled into doing something. You can lead someone up the garden path, and I think you can also lead someone down the garden path. Both prepositions work with that idiom. So in Spanish, it will be engañar. This person sold me a car, and they led me up the garden path. The car was not a good one. If something is better than it was before, you could say that it's come up roses or come up smelling of roses. Let's imagine, for example, a politician, there's been a crisis and this politician is accused of something, but they suddenly become very popular and always in the newspapers, always on the news. Maybe after the crisis, they become more popular, more successful. You could say that they come up smelling of roses. So it's a positive expression, to be better than before.
Well, that's it. We hope we've given you quite a few vocabulary items and expressions to refer to gardening. But now it's your turn to practice. Why don't you send us a voice message? You could send it to us at speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast.
And remember, you reap what you sow. So we'd love to hear your feedback so that you can practice your English. And if you prefer to send an email, you can reach me at Craig, Craig, at inglespodcast.com, or Reza is at Belfast, Reza, Reza, at gmail.com.
Why not try the online store? Go to store.mansioningles.net, and there you'll find all sorts of material to further practice your English. Listening, reading, writing, grammar, all the skills are there. Why not give it a go?
And before Reza and I go and dig up the garden and mow the grass today, we'd like to thank all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. We don't have time, unfortunately, to list all of the people who are part of our Patreon scheme, but we would like to thank the new Patreon supporters who have joined us this month, and they are Negesa, Eminem. I don't know if that's the rap singer who's joined our Patreon program, Eminem, or is that Eminem? But if it is the Eminem, I'll be very, very happy. And if it's not, I'm also happy that Eminem is now with us on Patreon. Enrique Gonzalvo, Antonio Tomas Palacios, thank you very much, all of you who are joining us. And if you would like to take part in our Patreon scheme for as little as $1.20 per month, and that's including VAT, value added tax, you get instant access to recent transcriptions. For more information, go to Patreon, patreon.com/Ingles podcast, and the link to Patreon and all of the vocabulary and idioms we've spoken about today can be found at inglespodcast.com/356. So Reza, what's on next week's episode?
Next week, we've got hippies and flower power.
I'm looking forward to that. So thank you very much for listening this week. Take care, stay safe, and until next time, it's goodbye from Reza.
And bye-bye from Craig.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.